and welcome to Lessons in Logic video number 47, I think. And we're finally getting to inductive logic in this video. And here's the cool picture I'm putting in the lower right-hand corner. And we begin, as is my new custom, with the zoom in on the whole thing, although I think I've used this one before. This is Hong Kong looking good from Kowloon Peak. And specifically, I believe this little spot is called Suicide Cliff. Suicide Peak, Suicide Cliff, Suicide Cliff, probably. Most of this is Kowloon. Anyway, let's send that to its corner and do logic. It is our first lesson in inductive logic. We're just starting our unit on inductive logic at last. And a tentative outline for this unit on inductive logic will be this. We'll talk about definitions for 1, 2, 3 videos, I don't know. Informal fallacies for 2, 3, 4 videos, I don't know, maybe 5. We'll do arguments from authority, arguments from analogy, and then arguments from authority, probably 1 video each. Mills methods, probably 1 video each, probably 1 video on inferences to the best explanation. And then we'll wrap it up with whatever seems necessary. Some review, some closing remarks, or whatever seems appropriate. This is, of course, tentative outline. The very structure of this logic course is still somewhat indetermined. I'm still making up a lot of this as I go. Now, the absolute first thing we have to do is talk about what inductive logic is. This will be, of course, a review. We've been talking about this all along. Logic can be understood as the study of methods for determining whether the premises of an argument provide good enough support for their conclusion. And inductive logic, on this definition of logic, is just the study of probabilistic arguments, or the study of methods for determining whether the premises of an argument provide good probabilistic support for their conclusion. Where deductive logic would be the study of methods for determining whether the premises of an argument guarantee their conclusion. So we've just wrapped up our main unit on deductive logic and its 2 subunits on categorical and statement logic. Now we're doing inductive logic. Now, I'm not entirely sure I like this definition as much as I used to. It's a pretty standard one. I may have got it from multiple textbooks, and I'm almost certain I got it from at least 1 textbook, and that textbook would be The Power of Logic by Lehman, Wasserman, Howard Snyder, and Howard Snyder. But here's a definition I think might be a little more accurate. Logic is the study of the relationships some propositions have to one another, and specifically the relationships premises have to conclusion. Logic is the study of how propositions support each other. Let's rewind. Let's do the very basics. Human beings have the ability to refer to things using words. I'm referring to this peanut jar when I say, hey, look at this empty peanut jar. Here's some more peanuts I can put in it later. Here's my teacup. I'm referring to my teacup. We refer to things and we make statements about things. The teacup is hot. Peanut jar is empty. There are new peanuts I can put into the peanut jar. We make statements about things. We refer to things, we make statements about them. And some statements are relevant to other statements, and sometimes that relevance has this characteristic one statement is supported by others. And when we make statements such that one is supported by others, what we're doing is making an argument. The nature of statements is such that sometimes one statement by itself or conjointly with other statements provides support for another statement. When we give statements in order to support a statement, thus, the one we're giving in support, the one we're giving as supported by others is the conclusion, and any statement we give in support of it is a premise. Logic is the study of that relationship of support between statements. And inductive logic is the study of probabilistic support. Deductive logic is the study of a more powerful kind of support, entailment. Deductive logic is the study of one particular type of support, where one proposition by itself or conjointly with other propositions entails another. Deductive logic as a study of that includes, but is not limited to, the study of methods for determining whether those premises guarantee their conclusion. And inductive logic is then the study of a different kind of support, probabilistic support. I should probably say merely, because technically, if premises give 100% a 100% guarantee for their conclusion, then that's a 100% probability, isn't it? So I should say merely probabilistic support. Inductive logic is the study of merely probabilistic support for one statement by other statements or an other statement. Deductive logic is the study of entailment, where one proposition, the conclusion is or is intended to be entailed by its respective premise or premises. And that includes the study of methods for determining whether that support is in place, but it also includes the proofing method, where we normally assume that a conclusion is indeed entailed, guaranteed by its premises, and we demonstrate that it is such. We're still studying that entailment, but we are we're not testing that we're not testing for the entailment. We're just studying the entailment. Okay, so this is the simpler, usual definition I've been giving for years. Go with it if it works for you. If this definition works for you, go with it. I think it's probably a little bit better. Let me just pause to see if I can give a parallel way of phrasing this. Entailment. It's not a word I often use. It's maybe a new vocabulary word for some of us. Deductive logic is the study of, well, I think I just know how to give a parallel phrasing. Entailment means one thing is entailed by another thing, or a set of things. In this case, one proposition is entailed by other propositions. And that means those other propositions guarantee it. Entailment means a guarantee. Entailment means one proposition guarantees another. Okay, or one set of propositions guarantees another, such that they can't be, the ones guaranteeing cannot be true and the one guaranteed false at the same time. All right, enough of this. That's a brief definition of what the heck is inductive logic. Oh, well, you know what? Inductive logic is the study of merely probabilistic support between propositions. And maybe I should also specify in what I've typed up here. Logic is the study of how some propositions individually or in groups support other propositions, and inductive logic is the study of a merely probabilistic support between those merely probabilistic support from some propositions to others. And here is how we're going to study it. We're going to talk about definitions and formal fallacies, and 4 different kinds, probably, this is the tentative schedule again, probably we'll talk about 4 different kinds of probabilistic support that can be good, although they're not necessarily good, and we want to have some ways of distinguishing the good ones from the bad ones. And this is not going to cover every kind of probabilistic support. I wouldn't really know how to cover everything. With the abbreviated truth table method, you may recall, in statement logic, in theory, we have a method by which we can test for validity any argument, assuming only we can represent it in symbolic statement logic. And in theory, that should be possible for any argument, as far as I can tell. But I can't give you that for inductive logic. I don't know anything that covers every kind of probabilistic support, or anything that, any strategy that will test any inductive argument to see whether the premises provide good probabilistic support. I can give you up to 5 useful strategies that will cover a lot, but it won't likely cover everything. Let's now talk about definitions. And this is a good place to start with the study of inductive logic, even though we're not going to get directly to a lot of clear methods, although I think we'll have some available methods here. Definitions. A good definition can clarify our concepts. This is central in Plato's writings. Socrates, in Plato's writings, is always walking around Athens talking to people, asking for definitions of important concepts. He'll say, tell me, Euthyphro, what is piety? Tell me, Cephalus, what is justice? Tell me, Lysis, what is friendship? A good definition can be the operative premise in some very important arguments. As I understand, the philosopher Baruch Spinoza, his entire philosophical system is built on the definition of substance. Let's phrase that, built on the definition. The definition of substance is the foundation of his whole philosophical system. So, and it's brilliant. There are few, if any, mistakes, and it's very good deductive logic. So basically, you have to be a Spinozistic pantheist, or be illogical, or be ignorant of the logic, or not accept his definition of substance. Now, that's the easy way. Most of us, maybe all of us, won't go that route. We won't accept his definition of substance. So that's my advice. Just don't bother with Spinoza's definition of substance, and then you don't have to be a Spinozistic pantheist. But anyway, a good definition can be the operative premise in very important arguments, and this is true with any number of arguments. I'm just naming one that comes to my mind and has been in my notes. A good definition can make discussions easier. Oh, this is fun. I'm glad I have this in my notes. Okay, so people sometimes talk about intelligent design, and sometimes there's a debate over whether intelligent design counts as science. Once that's established, there might still be questions about whether it's good science or bad science, or how good or how bad. And if it's not science, there might still be questions about, well, is it good philosophy or theology, or bad philosophy, theology? How good, how bad? Those are still perfectly possible questions. You might say it's not science, but it's still good because it's philosophy, and philosophy is freaking awesome and important. Or it is science, but it's just bad science. I've heard both of those perspectives. But I think the first thing to do is define science. Start by defining science. So if science, and this is probably not the best way to define science, but it's a good first effort that might help to resolve this particular issue. If you want more on definitions of science, I want to watch my Thomas Kuhn series and see what I can accomplish there. If science means just coming up with the best explanation of observed natural phenomena, I don't see why intelligent design theory could not qualify as science, at least in principle. But if science means using natural methods to come up with the best natural explanation of observed natural phenomena, I don't see how it could possibly be science, but it might still be good philosophy. Okay, so definitions can be important. 1, they can clarify our concepts. 2, they can be the premises that get arguments going. 3, they can clarify discussion. Sometimes you really need to stop a debate, a discussion, an argument, where the word argument is used in that other sense, 2 people disagreeing with each other. If you're not familiar with the Monty Python argument sketch, Google it. You should be able to find this on YouTube or somewhere, and I hope it's online legally. I do recommend this video on uses of the word argument. Argument can sometimes mean 2 or more people disagreeing with each other, and sometimes it means a set of statements where one is a conclusion, which is intended to be supported by the others, which are the premises. Okay, so in the Monty Python argument sketch, people have an argument about what an argument is. An argument can mean two people disagreeing with each other, or it can mean that logic class definition of argument. So we have a thoroughly pointless argument about what argument means, where argument could mean the kind of argument we're having, or it could mean an argument from a logic class, and argument as it's technically defined in logic class. So it's a great video, and the point I'm working on here is only that sometimes arguments in that sense, two or more people disagreeing with each other, need to stop, and we just need to define our terms, and then we might find out, oh, we don't actually disagree on anything here. It's just you're using this word one way, I'm using it another way. Then if you want to, you can argue about how the words should be used, but that's not as important as what you thought you were arguing about usually. This will probably come up again in my notes in a moment. Let's keep going though. Let's see if we can wrap this up. I need to give you some vocabulary words. Now, these first two words are often used in this, I think they're often used imprecisely. They're often used ambiguously. They're often used inaccurately. They're often used as if they're synonyms, but they're not actually synonyms. A term is vague if it has borderline cases. A term is ambiguous if it has more than one meaning. So the word bald isn't really ambiguous. It doesn't have more than one meaning. Cardinal is ambiguous. It does have lots of meanings. At least if we don't know how we're spelling it. I mean, are we capitalizing it? Cardinal could refer to a particular kind of North American bird. It could refer to a type of direction or color. It could refer to an official in the Roman Catholic Church. It could refer to a baseball team. Off the top of my head, I'm not good at this. I think there's at least one other team. My brain's freezing on which sport. I think there are at least two teams that are called the Cardinals. So the word cardinal is ambiguous because it can have lots of different meanings. The word bald is not ambiguous in that sense. It doesn't have a lot of different meanings, but it's very vague. I'm not bald, but my forehead's large enough that I don't know, maybe I'm moving that direction, although I've always had a large forehead, but it's probably getting a little larger. And at some point, it's going to be a little further back. Up to here, I'm not going to be bald. Up to here, I don't know, somewhere between here and here, I'm going to get to where you can just start saying, yeah, that guy's bald. He's not just going bald, he's bald. At some point, I'm likely to reach that. Where's that point? No one even knows. Maybe there isn't even a point. Maybe even God doesn't know. But if anyone does know it, it would have to be God, I would think. There are borderline cases somewhere between my hair starting here and my hair starting here. Somewhere in that range, I'm going to switch over from not being bald as such to being bald as such, right? That is a term with borderline cases, but it's not really ambiguous. Now, maybe some terms are ambiguous and vague. I think that does happen. Unfortunately, I can't think of a good example off the top of my head, but it does happen. But try not to get confused. A term is vague if it has borderline cases. A term is ambiguous if it has more than one meaning. Here are two useful terms. Definiendum means the term to be defined. Definiens means the word or words that do the defining. If you've ever studied Latin, you might recognize the structure of these words. It looks like the first one is what is this? A future passive participle, maybe? Second one looks to me like a present active participle. At any rate, these are based on Latin participles. Definiendum is a term to be defined. Definiens is the word or words that do the defining. Now, types of definitions. There are two different kinds of definitions, speaking rather basically. There are extensional definitions and intentional definitions. Now, I didn't pronounce that properly. I should say intentional. Try not to confuse this with intentional with an extra T. How do I have a not equal sign? That's probably available. I'll just say it's not the same as. We are spelling it intentional with an S, not intentional with a T. All right, an extensional definition names the members of the class denoted by the term. An intentional definition names the properties of the class denoted by the term. In Plato's dialogues, you see this a lot. Socrates will ask, what is justice? And someone will say, let's do justice. Let's do, I think that will work in the first book of the Republic, but I don't feel like doing justice. Virtue. Let's do virtue from Meno, Plato's Meno. Socrates asks, what is virtue? And Meno gives him answers like, virtue is doing this sort of thing, or that sort of thing, or this other sort of thing. Specifically, virtue is this sort of activity for a man, this sort of activity for a woman, this sort of activity for children. That's virtue for these different kinds of people. And Socrates will try to steer the conversation towards intentional definitions. Now, I don't really understand what virtue is if you just give me examples. I don't want examples. I want you to tell me what is the essential nature of virtue. I want you to tell me the properties of the class denoted by the term. So virtue may denote different kinds of behaviors, or different kinds of human activity, or different kinds of character traits. But I want to know, what is it that makes each of them virtue? Don't just give me examples. Name the properties that make a thing virtue. Socrates will always try to steer the conversation in the direction of intentional definitions, usually with some resistance. Now, in principle, there's nothing wrong with extensional definitions. It's just intentional definitions might give more clarity. I think it's useful to be able to work with both. And frankly, for any number of things, I do find it easier to work with extensional definitions. But actually, and this is something you do find in interesting sources, like Roderick Chisholm's famous epistemology article, The Problem of the Criterion, wonderful article. Sometimes it's useful to start with extensional definitions and then move to intentional definitions. Sometimes the best way to give a good intentional definition, to name the properties of the class denoted by a term, is to give a good list of the things that are denoted by a term. You want to name the essential characteristics of virtue. First, come up with a list of things that are virtues: courage, wisdom, moderation. Wisdom, courage, moderation, justice. Let me pause and jump over to the east here. Lai, or Yan, Ren. How do I just say this in regular English? The virtue of ritual, or you could almost say politeness, and the virtue of humanity, or kindness, or benevolence, to give some of the translations of Yan, Ren. These are two Confucian virtues, Li and Ren, Lai and Yan. I'm using different pronunciations for Mandarin, Putonghua, or Cantonese, Guangdonghua here. So Li and Ren, ritual and humanity or kindness, these are virtues in the Confucian tradition. So you could name them. You could name Li, Ren, and wisdom, courage, justice, moderation, or maybe patience or piety, or in the theological traditions, we're likely to say faith, hope, love, or at least that's a famous list of 3 virtues from Christian thinkers. Any number of traditions will also say humility is a virtue, though apparently Aristotle does not agree. So you could give this nice list of virtues. Then you can say, here's some other things that are not virtues: pride, arrogance, dishonesty, and maybe you want to mention honesty over in the virtue category. Hard work, and then put laziness and along with dishonesty in the category of things that are not virtues, along with cowardness and injustice and all that. So make a nice list of virtues, make a nice list of things that are not virtues, and then look at the things that are virtues and see what they all have in common. Or look at the things that are not virtues and see what they all have in common. In particular, what do all of these things have that none of these things have? That they all have, that these other ones don't have. That's going to be an essential property of virtue. That's how you get an intentional definition, by starting with a good list, give a good extensional definition, and then study it, reason from it to come up with an intentional definition. That's a good strategy recommended by Roderick Chisholm in the study of epistemology in his article, The Problem of the Criterion. And here I am talking too much, as usual. 4 good kinds of definition. A stipulative definition is an intentional definition which specifies a term independently of convention. For example, you can say, for the purposes of our discussion, let's define our terms this way. Let the term person refer to any sentient being with free will. Or in a different context, let free will refer to the ability to do what you want, or let free will, for the purposes of this discussion, refer to the ability to do otherwise than you do. Or for the remainder of this article, I think I actually wrote this quite recently in an article I wrote. For the remainder of this article, I will use the term free will in the libertarian sense, as it's called, referring to the ability to do otherwise than we do. And you might also have to define the term libertarian, but you probably won't need a stipulative definition. A stipulative definition is independent of convention. A precising definition will reduce the vagueness of a term by imposing limits on the conventional meaning. It starts at the lexical definition and makes it more precise. So now that I've said that, let me add just a little bit more. Let me give an example of precising definition and then get back to the term libertarian. A precising definition. When does a person become an adult? And it may vary for different purposes. For purposes of purchasing alcohol or cigarettes, for purposes of voting, for purposes of when you can have a full driver's license, and any number of other things, and let's not just keep listing them. For different purposes, the distinction between a non-adult and an adult is kind of vague. It's not like you're completely ineligible to purchase alcohol on one day, and then the next day, because technically it's your birthday, you're suddenly eligible. Well, legally you might be, but it's not like you're completely irresponsible on Tuesday, and then on Wednesday you're suddenly perfectly mature, and there's no reason in the world any government should tell you you're not allowed to purchase alcohol. There's some vagueness there. Somewhere between 2 years before that birthday and 2 years after that birthday, you probably pass over from being too immature to being mature enough. Well, hopefully you do pass over into being mature enough if you're going to do that anyway. So there's some vagueness here. There's no one point at which this happens, but for purposes of law, you have to draw the line somewhere. Law is filled with precising definitions, and if you ever needed to come up with a specific definition of when does a person count as bald, for I don't know, I suppose some jobs might require people with hair. I don't know, maybe actors, maybe some films require that the person playing a particular role not be bald because this character has hair and we don't want to fake it with CGI. So you have to not be bald, and the people running the movie might have to come up with a precising definition of baldness. I'm trying to come up with an example where you might actually need a precising definition of baldness. It's probably not a great example, but it probably does happen from time to time in one context or another. So you might have to say, for our purposes, we define baldness as your hairline starts, I don't know, 6 inches, 7 inches, 8 inches, 10 inches above your nose or something like that. So precising definitions are important in law, and they do come up in some places, even including, I would imagine, on rare occasions, baldness. But also, here's another one. I don't know why this wasn't in my notes, except that maybe some textbook should have included it, didn't. Usually my notes, as I keep saying, are relying more than anything else on The Power of Logic by Lehman, Howard Snyder, Wasserman. Maybe this is one weakness of earlier versions of their textbook. Maybe they fixed it by now, I don't know. But I think this should be listed as well. A disambiguating definition would be almost exactly the same thing as a precising definition, except it reduces ambiguity. An intentional definition which reduces ambiguity of a term by imposing limits on the conventional meaning. In other words, start with a good lexical definition and make it more precise. Well, I better jump up and define lexical definition. A lexical definition gives the conventional meaning of a term. This is what you find in any dictionary. So now sometimes dictionary terms like baldness are vague, and sometimes they're ambiguous. And so for the purposes of having a clear discussion, sometimes you need to give a good precising definition. For our purposes, bald means so many inches above the nose, or for purposes of legal purchase of alcohol in the state of Texas, you have to have reached your 21st birthday or whatever. And a disambiguating definition might say, for purposes of our discussion, we're going to use the term free will to refer to someone having the ability to do otherwise. In other words, free will in the libertarian sense. So I think I wrote that in a paper. And if I said that was a stipulative definition, I don't think it was, actually. I think that was just a disambiguating definition, because the term free will can be used in different ways. Some people use the term free will to refer to just being able to do what you want to do. And the other major definition of free will is the ability to do otherwise. You do what you do, but you could have done otherwise. You really could have. It was within your power to do otherwise. There's some possible world where you did differently. That's free will in one major definition of the term. There are other definitions of free will. So I think those are both conventional definitions. So I don't think if we choose one of them, we're independent of convention. No, we're disambiguating. So when I wrote in my paper, for the remainder of this paper, I'm going to use the term free will in the libertarian sense. I'm giving a disambiguating definition. Now, you may also have to give a disambiguating definition. Let's get back to the term libertarian, a disambiguating definition of the term libertarian. Because in politics, or in political theory, or maybe even more generally in ethics, the word libertarian refers to a particular theory about how we should live, or a particular theory of government, something about government should do almost nothing except restrict activity that impinges on someone else's freedom, or something like that. The word libertarian, when we're talking about free will, specifically means the ability to do otherwise. It means a particular theory of free will. Libertarian, or libertarianism, in the study of free will and related matters, means that. And it's not even about a theory of government. You could be a libertarian in your theory of government and not even believe in free will in this metaphysical sense. Or you could be a libertarian and have a different theory of free will. Or you could be a libertarian in that you think we have that kind of free will, but not be a libertarian in your philosophy of government. You could be some sort of liberal, progressive, or conservative, or something else. Great example might be the word materialism and the word idealism. My students used to get confused over this. Like they raise their hand in class and say, "Sir, I was told that Karl Marx is an idealist. Why are you telling me that Karl Marx is a materialist and not an idealist?" And it's because in philosophy, when we're talking about theory of reality, metaphysics, we normally say Hegel is an idealist, where idealist means you think ideas are real things. And Marx is a materialist, meaning he thinks all is matter, ideas are not real things. And in political science, idealist might mean you have certain ideals that you try to achieve in society. You don't, you do think it's possible to achieve them in the real world. Idealism is the opposite of maybe pragmatism or something like that. So idealism is the opposite of pragmatism in political science, and then idealism is the opposite of materialism in metaphysics. So Karl Marx is a materialist, not an idealist, but he's an idealist, not a pragmatist, or something like that. Again, all these terms might have to be defined more carefully. But in two different senses, the term idealist, Marx is and is not an idealist. So you have to, for the purposes of a clear discussion, as I had to explain to my students, we're using the words in different ways, guys. You have to disambiguate a term, an intentional definition which reduces ambiguity by imposing limits on the conventional meaning. For our purposes, we're using the word libertarian in this sense. We're not doing the politics sense, we're doing the free will sense. For our purposes, we're using the word free will in this libertarian sense, not in this other sense. For our purposes, in this class, modern political philosophy, we're using the word idealist and the word materialist in their metaphysical senses. And Karl Marx is a materialist, definitely not an idealist. All right, now Socrates, what he's really looking for is a theoretical definition. That would be an intentional definition that tries to help us understand the thing defined. That would be the one that really clarifies things. That would be the ideal clarity of concepts that Socrates is looking for. All right. So those are some types of definition. There's two basic kinds of definition. There's four kinds of 5 kinds of intentional definitions that are good, or at least they can be good if you do them well. There are bad kinds of definitions. Now, this is something that is more obviously about logic. What we're doing in this video is, well, after we introduce inductive logic, what we do in this video is we talk about definitions. We're trying to think clearly. If it's not obvious how this is logic, if it's not obvious how this is the study of probabilistic support, or the study methods for determining whether the premises of an argument provide good probabilistic support for their conclusion, well, at least know this: we're trying to think clearly, and that's close enough. But also, this stuff likely comes up later when we're doing more logic. I can't promise I'll always make the connections in later videos. Hopefully I will, but I certainly can't promise that. But this might be more obviously about logic. This happens. People give definitions that are slanted in favor of a particular conclusion. For example, if you say the Republican Party is the party of greedy rich guys, or no, what would we say these days? Maybe not so much greedy rich guys, but something about white guys. I'm not sure if that's the normal persuasive definition against Republicans, but it seems maybe a little more accurate. What did I just have written here? Greedy rich guys. That seems like persuasive definition against Republicans from 10 or 20 years ago. This one seems a little closer to persuasive definition against Republicans from the present. Okay, so the Republican Party is the party of heterosexual white guys or something, and the Democrat Party is the party of tree-hugging hippies. Let me think. I'm not sure if I need to update that. That's probably one you'll still regularly hear against the Democrats. So these appear to be persuasive definitions. They seem to be slanted in favor of a particular conclusion. If you just define a whole perspective or point of view or group of people in such a way that your very definition forces a particular conclusion, then you're probably doing it wrongly. You're probably doing it wrongly. Now, I suppose if you define the Nazis as jerks, that's not so bad, actually. I won't say a definition that supports a particular conclusion is necessarily bad, but one, it ought to really get at the real characteristics of the thing. You can't just say Nazis are jerks, because there's lots of different kinds of jerks. And Heidegger, well, I mean, I won't say he wasn't a jerk. I mean, technically he was a Nazi, but he wasn't the same kind of jerk as Hitler by a long shot. But the immediate point I'm trying to get at is you ought to specify what kind of jerk you're talking about. Don't just define Nazis as jerks, but define them as jerks of a particular kind. So I won't say every definition slanted, and every definition that's in support of this particular conclusion is necessarily a bad kind of definition. A persuasive definition is one that's in favor of a particular conclusion, but that doesn't necessarily make it bad. What makes it bad is it's improperly in favor of a particular conclusion, or it's slanted, where slanted has a negative connotation. It's inappropriately slanted in favor of a particular conclusion. So as much as possible, when you're constructing good, here's the connection to logic we really need. I'll draw it out for lots of this material. I'll scroll up and say it, and then maybe we'll be finished with this video. When you're making arguments, when you're having discussions about things, about the virtues, about political parties, about free will, about political systems, what else have I mentioned? Let's mention some other things. About society, about religion, about use of social media, about eating meat versus eating peanuts, about all kinds of things, from vegetarianism to religion to free will to politics to what are the virtues. When you have discussions about these things, use good definitions. Don't have a definition that is unfairly slanted in favor of a particular conclusion. Rather have definitions that are preferably intentional ones that do something to help us understand the thing defined ideally. but that at least facilitate clear discussion, no pointless disagreements about how a word is used when you really should be disagreeing about the facts. And if you must use extensional definitions, which is also often useful, do it, but do it well. When you're having discussions about these things, don't use definitions that are unfairly slanted in favor of a particular conclusion. Use definitions that get at the heart of the matter. Defeat your opponents in logical combat fairly. Don't try to defeat them by defining them as bad from the start. Rather, give a fair definition of what is the actual position you're refuting or the actual people you're disagreeing with. Give a fair definition, preferably a definition they could agree with, and then go on to explain what's wrong with that position. And be as clear as possible with vagueness, ambiguity, definiendum versus definiens, and all of these other things. All right, that's enough of that. I will see you next time. For talking too much, my apologies. For talking unclearly, again, my apologies. We can hopefully clear it up in comments if you like. Anyway, see you next time on the next inductive logic video. And a brief addendum on persuasive definitions, because I remembered a couple of examples I wanted to talk about. Let's first mention a particular definition of Democrat. The definition of Democrat I have in mind defines the word Democrat as unmitigated scoundrel. Now, this definition turns up in Alvin Plantinga's famous talk, Advice to Christian Philosophers. You can find it on the internet, the whole text. Advice to Christian Philosophers by Alvin Plantinga. He says, what if I defined the word Democrat as unmitigated scoundrel? Does that mean that Democrats everywhere should just hang their heads in shame? And of course the answer is no, they shouldn't. Because that's not actually a correct definition of the word Democrat. It's not getting at essential characteristics of Democrats or defining typical characteristics of Democrats. What it is taking some criticism of Democrats and writing it into the very definition of Democrats. It's a persuasive definition. In other words, Plantinga is not using this definition of Democrat by any means. He's suggesting it as an illustration of a particular kind of mistake. In logic class terms, that mistake is using persuasive definitions. But let me phrase it a different way. The mistake Plantinga is criticizing is the mistake of defending your position by writing your position into the definition of a word. Now, what he has in mind in particular has nothing to do with politics. What he has in mind in particular is a different persuasive definition he considers. And that would be a definition of meaning that might be employed by the logical positivists. Now, I really have to keep this super brief. I go over it in detail elsewhere on this channel. Logical positivism is this 1900s movement in philosophy that says that the meaning of a sentence is it's being empirically verifiable. Let me rephrase that. That wasn't precise enough. Logical positivism's central claim is that a sentence is meaningful only if it can be empirically tested and verified, only if it can be confirmed and experienced. Logical positivism gives this as a criterion for meaning. A sentence can only be meaningful if it can be empirically verified. So Alvin Plantinga, in Advice to Christian Philosophers, talks about how for a good long while Christians were intimidated by this because they thought their theology was not empirically verifiable in the way the logical positivists were talking about. And Plantinga says they should not have been intimidated. One problem is that the logical positivists never gave any good arguments for their criterion of meaning. Another problem is that they usually didn't give arguments at all. They would just repeat their criterion of meaning loudly and slowly. But why should that have bothered anyone? Plantinga wonders. And Plantinga says, well, we could try, or they could try, the logical positivists could try defining the word meaning in terms of their empirical criterion. They could say, the definition of meaning is this. A sentence has meaning if and only if it can be empirically verified. And then Plantinga says they have every right to define the word meaning in that way. It's a free country. But why should the rest of us care? In other words, it would be a persuasive definition. If they defined the word meaning in their way, they would just be trying to promote their pet theory by writing it into the definition of a word. But that's kind of silly, and why should any of the rest of us care? And that's why he gives his definition of his not serious definition of Democrat as a mitigated scoundrel to illustrate the silliness of this approach. Alvin Plantinga's advice to Christian philosophers critiques one persuasive definition by illustrating with a suggested persuasive definition of Democrat as unmitigated scoundrel that he doesn't endorse, but uses to illustrate the folly of a different persuasive definition.